Hello and welcome to another episode of Raptors Pilgrimage. My name is ALD and we are about to get into it today. This is the third video. This is the third vlog I'll have done today. I just finished up teaching you all about how to read Raptor in episode 3, Learning Raptor. So if you want to learn that, certainly go back and watch that video. It's just an introduction to it. I'm not sure if it's helpful to anybody, if you'll be able to make sense of it. Certainly I could probably go into more detail, but it'd be a much longer video. And maybe I will, maybe I won't, we'll see. But today what we're going to talk about is my idea for a controller that I've called the NSTRMNT, and about the basics of, or maybe we'll get into deep conversation about my video game ALD Online. So I'm sharing everything today. In all likelihood, I'll never get any viewers, and this will be just for me. So I really just like talking out loud. I don't know if you can tell. I just like hearing the sound of my voice, and I really enjoy talking to the camera and hearing these ideas out loud. So we'll jump right into it. But before I start explaining the instrument controller, I want to express the reason behind why I think it's necessary. So the story is, I've fallen in love with virtual reality, with VR gaming. And I'm a little upset that there isn't more being developed regarding it, because it's incredible. Running around in 3 dimensions in VR is such an experience. It's just so, there's not a lot of it right now. There's very little content. I mean, there's I guess you could say there's a lot. There's nothing really that I've found that engages me. That said, I really haven't paid for a lot. I've mostly been doing the free stuff, and the free stuff is all really kind of lame. But that said, maybe the paid stuff is a lot more interesting. But the thing that I want to kind of get across is that most of the VR games that we have right now use motion controllers, use 3-dimension movement motion controllers for controlling them. And I hate that. I don't want that at all. I mean, I don't want my arms to get tired from gaming. You know, I want to be able to just sit and relax in a chair, comfortable, and game with a regular controller that I can just hold in my hands and do everything that I need to do in the game. And but that just doesn't exist right now. All this it's like people think that motion control is the next step in gaming, and I really don't think it is. I think we've kind of found a comfortable place in our technology, in our advancement, where the controller is the perfect solution to gaming scenarios, where you can transform all of your mental activity into one concise activity. And so from mental activity to physical activity, and it all happens on the controller. Now, you know, PC gamers might complain that, oh, you know, I need a keyboard and mouse to be accurate and all this stuff. And I just think that's, you know, like, if you can't game with a controller, then you're not a true gamer. If you need a keyboard and mouse to be accurate and to be good, then that's kind of sad. I think a game controller is the universal, like, it rounds out the playing field. And it really makes players, it requires a lot of skill to be good. That's what I mean. That's what I mean. Like, it requires a lot of skill to be good with a controller, and it doesn't require that much skill to be accurate and good with a keyboard and mouse. Just saying. That's my opinion. Many of you might not agree. But the thing about a controller, the standard controller we have. Now I've got a fairly standard controller layout here where you've got 4 face buttons, you've got a D-pad, you've got 2 thumbsticks, you've got 2 triggers on the front side here, 2 triggers, right and left, and then you've got 2 bumpers, right and left. And that's basically it. That's the standard. That's the standard controller layout. And what's restrictive about it is that all of the controls have to do with these 4 fingers, 2 thumbs and 2 index fingers. Think about it. All of this activity, the face buttons and the thumbsticks and the D-pad are all the thumbs, and then the index fingers literally have 2 buttons apiece. That's it. It's the most creative we can get. And so that I think of that as being very restrictive because there's so much more. I mean, on a keyboard, you have a layout of keys and your hand can move from left to right and you can press all these keys and you can get very good. So the keyboard and mouse can be a little bit more engaging. But I think I've come up with a solution, at least a theoretical solution, which will transform the way that we're capable of gaming. Now, the instrument, the name of my product, my idea, is sort of, in my mind, it's very telling. That's why I chose the name Instrument, because I'm drawing from the theory of playing an actual instrument, which is that when you play an instrument, you're using all your hands, all of your fingers. You know, if you play a saxophone, if you play an oboe, if you play guitar, fingerstyle, if you play piano, you're using all 10 of your fingers. And I don't see why, as gamers, we're being restricted to just 4. And so what we really need is we need a controller designed to be used by all of our fingers. And so this controller idea I have is sort of came from a 2-pronged, or two reasons is what birthed it. Birth, that's such a, ugh, why did I just use that word? But the one reason was I had this idea for a video game. I had this idea, and I'll get into what the idea is, but I had this idea for a video game that I wanted to create because I wasn't happy with the way that with the state of video games as they are, and I wanted more complexity and I wanted more engagement with the world. And then on the other hand, I was hoping that I could engage with virtual reality in a more deep way. So I guess it might sort of be the same. I'm thinking about how when you're wearing a VR headset, your eyes are covered. You can't see. You've got a screen in front of your eyes, so you can't see the keyboard. If you're using a keyboard and mouse, you can't see the keyboard. But you can certainly hold a controller in your hand and know where every button is. It's really intuitive that way. So if a controller has enough buttons, you can map a whole keyboard and you type. You could write books, documents in virtual reality, and that's sort of where the one aspect of it from. Whereas I wanted to be able to browse the internet, I wanted to be able to do work. In my mind, because something that's great about virtual reality is you can pull up virtual screens and you can bring them further and closer away, and you can have multiple of them. And each of them, one can have a YouTube video, the next one can have Facebook open, the next one could be a Word document, and the other one could be researching Wikipedia. And you could have all 4, or 6. You could have 2 in front of you and 2 to either side. And you could have so many screens going at once and in a virtual reality, and all you guys turn your head to look at each one of them. But they could all be going on at the same time. And but to interact with them, you need a proper tool. And so a keyboard is one tool, you know, a keyboard and mouse, but you have to be really good at knowing where your hands are and moving from the mouse back to the keyboard and keyboard to the mouse, back and forth when you can't see them. It'd be very difficult. I mean, when we're working with them in real life, I mean, people get good at typing without looking at their hands. You know, that's why we have typing class in school. But you're still using your peripheral. Like I don't think we're giving enough emphasis on how much peripheral vision we have. So when we move our hand back and forth, we're using our peripheries. I mean, maybe not 100%, but I definitely think we certainly are to some degree. And think of how much time you're going to waste trying to get your hand back to the home row on a keyboard. And so that's where I see the solution is having a keyboard that you can hold onto and not have to move your hand around. Whereas the thumbstick will be your mouse and the buttons will be your keyboard. So that's the one aspect of why I thought, you know, there needed to be improvement. And then on the other hand, I felt like I had this idea for a video game, and I knew I needed more buttons because, okay, so I don't know if you've ever played the game Magica, but it's a game where you summon elements in a string or a code, and then you cast that spell. And so you have 8 keys that you use, but the game's third person, and you use the mouse to move around. And it's very limiting in the way that you can interact with the world. It's a fun game, don't get me wrong. I love it, and I've played hours and hours and hours of it. But it's ultimately very limiting. And my dream is to take that same idea, that same spell casting and magic system, develop it so it's a little deeper and more complex, and then apply it to a first-person game. And so for a first-person game, you need a pretty standard setup for of a controller. You need your thumbsticks for movement and looking around. You need, you know, your triggers for action, but then you need extra buttons just dedicated for summoning magic. And so that's when I first thought of adding buttons for these fingers to be used on the underside of the controller. So if you think of this as being more flat and not so, you know, rounded, imagine that there were 12 buttons, 6 on each side, 2, 4, 6 on each side. So you have a middle position and then back and forth. And so you've got 12 buttons dedicated for casting magic. Now it's actually changed, and I'll get into that later, but what I'm talking about is sort of where the idea started. So I initially was like, okay, we can add more buttons. There's space for that. I mean, there are fingers that aren't doing anything, and we can incorporate that. And so once I started thinking about adding buttons, it started to open up this idea that if there are enough buttons, we can map the whole keyboard. And I've actually figured it all out, and it's very complicated, and but it's not really, like, if you think about it, it's not really all that complicated. It's fairly straightforward and simple. It's just adding buttons in the right places. And but the next thing I thought of was I wanted to be able to interact with the virtual world in a more deep and meaningful way. And what I mean by that is that in games like, say, Skyrim and Fallout, they're first person, that are great games, there's a sort of breaking point as far as immersion goes. And that's where you're interacting with the world as far as combat goes. And what I mean by that is, you know, when you swing a weapon, it's a defined pattern of attack. It's usually like a cross, back and forth. You know, it's so straightforward, and it gets boring really quick. And you don't choose how to do it. It just, the game chooses for you. It's a set pattern, or it's random, and there's not a whole lot to it. It's just pull the trigger. And that's really boring. And anyway, so I was trying to figure out, how can I implement control over the attack patterns? And I was like, well, you'd have to be able to control your arms. That was what I surmised. And so I thought of, I racked my brain for trying to figure out all of these different ways wherein a person could control their arms. And I had thought of a couple of different ways using a standard controller. And I started writing up this document of how the controls would augment depending on how or be modified depending on how, in what order you press them. And it was really complicated and really convoluted. And honestly, it turns out the solution is much, much simpler. I thought about creating some new technology, but I really was feeling deep inside that there's got to be a way to do it with current technology. And there is. The answer is really simple. Because, and you may have realized that, why don't we add more buttons for these fingers, for the two middle fingers on the underside? Like, why don't we add more buttons here? Well, that's because of my solution. Because originally I thought, well, let's just put 9 buttons on each side and have 18 down here. But you don't need all those buttons. What you need are 2 more thumbsticks, but on the underside for these fingers. So like this. And but right here on the underside of the controller. And it's really simple. It's like the application of it is really straightforward and simple. And I'm going to get into the why behind it, but I wanted to tell you what I call them. I call them muddle sticks, for middle finger underneath, muddle. So these are thumbsticks, and then these would be your muddle sticks. And how you use them is really quite intuitive and simple. So you have 2 axes, up, down, and left and right. And so each stick will be controlling one arm. And so pressing up moves your arm up. Moving down moves your arm down. Right moves right. Left moves left. And so your hands in the game will be at a standard position, sort of right here in front of you, kind of like they are in games as we currently play them. But now you can move your hand. You can control your hand left and right, up and down. So we've taken care of 2 of our axes. But now the question becomes, how do we get more? And how do I like, I'm trying not to spoil. I am spoiling it. Point is, we reconfigure the purpose of our triggers such that they control our arms in the z-axis, or, I mean, it depends on which axes you call which. I mean, I consider this X, this Y, and this is Z. And so if we consider this our 0 position, then the controller is in a 0 position. And when we pull the trigger, it moves to a 100% position, which is fully extended. And that's 100%. So now we can move our hands on our arms, therefore, in all directions of motion. I mean, to a degree. I mean, you can't move your hands back behind you, but certainly you can control them in front of you. So now, you know, if we start applying this, we have our hands here. We can move out and in or just straight across, like in and forward at the same time, and you get these cross punches. You move it out and then forward and in, you get a hook. If you move it down and then forward and up, you get an uppercut. So you've got some basic punching patterns, which probably be the most effective. And then, of course, you can go out and then down like this, and you get these weird, you know, punching patterns that will have their purpose in the game. But what's great about this is now you have control, and now you feel like you're engaged in the activity. And you can apply that to swinging swords. And I still have a lot of thinking to do with how it applies to like holding guns, you know, two-handed swords, or hammers or axes or a bow. Like, how does it apply to a bow? And I've still got a lot of development to go along those lines, but I definitely feel that there's an answer there. But what's really interesting was because once I figured that out, I started to think about, okay, how do we apply this same technology or the same advancement or augmentation, let's say, to controlling our legs? And so my first initial thought was add 2 more sticks, and you know, but then where do you add them? What fingers control them? And it just got like, you know, if you had 4 sticks down here, it would just be a nightmare. It would just be a nightmare. And we don't want that. I mean, it's already going to be hard enough for the average player to get used to 2 extra sticks down here. But it certainly can be done. It certainly can be done. I've gotten very used to the feeling of it myself. And certainly if a gamer were to start their career, if we can call it a career, in gaming with this controller, it wouldn't be no thing. Because I remember the first time somebody gave me a controller with 2 thumbsticks, and I had no idea what to do with them, you know, but I got used to it, and I'm good at it now because and it's easy now. Like, it's not just that I'm good at it. It's easy. It's second nature. I don't even have to think about it. So certainly we can get used to two more controllers, muddle sticks. But I really wanted to give control of the legs to the player. And this is where I think I've come up with a great solution. And it combines one of my original solutions to the first problem, which is modifying the controls. And so without adding any new input, we can modify the input we now have to control the legs. And what I mean by that is I've kind of got, what am I trying to say? I kind of set it up such that if you think of the movement button or the movement stick, which is typically the left thumbstick. It's pretty standard. The left thumbstick is for movement. And so when you're sprinting or when you're moving forward, when you click the left thumbstick, because it's also a button, you usually start sprinting. That's pretty standard too. But when you're not moving, it doesn't do anything. You're just clicking it. It doesn't have a purpose. And so that, I thought of, could be the activation. So when you click the movement stick, when you're not moving, it switches the control of the muddle stick's control of your arms to your legs. And it's a little complicated, and you know, I need to do a video. I need to do like a 3-dimensional video with a model, an in-game model, and a third-person view, so I can show how movement of the controller will move the in-game model. And I likely will do that one day. But just for talking about it, for simplicity's sake, we can consider that moving forward moves your foot forward, moving back moves your foot backwards, moving to the right moves it to the right, and then moving it left moves it into the left, and that your feet are typically standing pretty straight and stock, with a small gap between them, so about shoulder width apart. And I love coffee. And then pulling the triggers, okay, lift the knee and to about, I'd say, this is where I need to do some more development, some more thinking. But I know I'm in the right direction. So to kind of express how this would be useful is, so, if you are a player who is mostly a melee character, so you're swinging swords and you're attacking with your arms, then you want control of those muddle sticks to be the arms, and you just want your movement to be fairly straightforward and standard. And so you just want to be attacking, right? But if you want to kick, if you want to attack with your legs, right, then your hands become stationary, and then you become sort of stationary, but you can control your legs. So now you can move and you can attack with your legs. And you could be a character who specializes in kicking and kickboxing. But if you're a character who uses a gun, you can either choose, okay, this is where it becomes very nuanced, is you can either choose to control the gun with your arms and the recoil with your arms, or you can set your gun to be stock straight, shooting in one direction, but you have to control your legs. So now movement becomes difficult, and you control your legs to turn your body and to control where you're aiming, right? Or you control your arm and you have to control the difficulty of the weapon recoil, and you can move freely. So that's the trade-off, right? And I just love how intense and interesting that dynamic would be in my game. And so that's really all that I think is necessary to say. There's a few more advancements in that both of these will be D-pads or directional pads, but they'll be pentagons. They'll have 5 points, so it won't be 4, and there won't be 8 directions. There'll be 10 directions, and then again there'll be 12 buttons underneath of the controller for these fingers. But then the other thing is, along with the 2 triggers, is there will be 4 bumper buttons. There'll be 2 up, top, and bottom index buttons, and then what I call the index buttons, and then there'll be a top and bottom bumper. So you'll have 4 buttons here for the index finger to control, as well as the triggers. So 5 for each. So there's a lot of buttons for the thumb. There's many buttons for these fingers. There's also there'll be 2 extra buttons here and here on each side. So in total, there will be 12 buttons plus the thumbsticks for the thumbs to control. So we're adding a little bit more complexity for the thumbs. But anyways, that's sort of that. That's where we're at with the controller. Now, and that's like a basic introduction without going into incredible more detail. I feel like I've gone into as much detail as is necessary. The game itself, I kind of explained most of what makes the game special already, is the magic system and the combat, how the combat will be extremely complex, extremely. I really want to push the limit of what is necessary for gamers to, like, or not necessary, but what is required of them in order to perform at a high level. Because right now, I mean, there are gamers who perform at a very high level and they're extremely good at it, but I almost think they're bored. I think it's to the point where they're so bored because they're not being challenged enough. And I think that's where my controller and my game come in, is that these high level players will be challenged in such a way that they'll actually feel like they have the full complement of tools necessary to express themselves fully. Whereas I don't think they have that right now. Now, the average player, it might be too much. I don't know. I really think that if people, especially young children and young players, if they start at a young age, it'll be second nature to them. They'll pick it up and they won't have any problem playing my game or using this controller in whatever way, like people, like what kinds of games people can develop. Because I mean, now you have to think about what else can we do with 2 extra thumbsticks? What more can we implement? Especially if you take away the control of the arms for a game. And the possibilities just become endless. I mean, they already almost have been, but I feel like we're reaching a limit to what we can do in video games now with current technology. But with my theoretical design, we can do so much more. And so my game is really complex. The combat's really complex. The magic system is really complex. And I kind of want to talk about that now and what that entails. So if you've played Magicka, then you already know the basis of my system. It's summoning elements in a combination to cast unique spells. And it's how you cast them that also creates unique spells. So there'll be a variety of ways of casting spells in order to create unique what am I trying to say? Point is, it's going to be very, very complex. So not only do you have combination spells, but you have ways of casting them. So certain strings of spells, when cast a certain way, will be like an invisibility spell. But that same spell, if you cast it another way, is just a beam or a burst or an explosive symbol. And without getting too much into that, because I haven't really thought about that a whole lot, what I've been working on is the what I call the affinity system, which is that however much you've used an element, you gain an affinity for that element. And what I mean by that is, say for the last 10 elements you've used, what percentage of those elements was fire, was water, was ice, was wood, was time, was dimension. And so you gain an affinity for that element based off of how much you've used it in the last 10 spells. But then you have another bucket. The next bucket is, say, 20 or 30 spells. The next bucket is 50 to 60 spells. The next bucket is 100. The next bucket is 1,000. The next bucket is 5,000. The next bucket is, and so you have these groups, this grouping, and so you have an immediate affinity. So your immediate affinity is how much you've used a spell recently within the last 10 spells, which will have an effect on the next spell that you cast. And then again, the last 20 spells, or the last 20 elements, and the last Ooh, I got an itchy head. It's warm in my room. So for as an example for what those affinities might be, it's say say for the 1,000. Say if you have 20% of the last 1,000 elements that you've cast were fire spells, were fire elements, then you have a +1 element to your casting limit of fire. You get a +1 fire limit. And what that means is perhaps say for your level or your abilities, you can summon 6 elements. And so if you make all of them fire, you can cast 1 more fire. Or if you make all of them wood, you can then cast 1 more fire. So it doesn't matter what you cast for those 6. You can always cast a 7th that just has to be fire. But you can change that affinity because say it's 20% of the last 1,000 that you've cast. So that would be like 200. The last 200 or 200 of the last 1,000 that you've cast can be ice, you know, and then you get 1 more ice. And so for the last 1,000, say, for example, you could cast 200 of 5 different elements. So you could have 5 extra slots of 1 of each of those individual spells or elements. And so that's how you build. That's one way that you can build out the number of slots that you have. And I'm still thinking of ways like of how to limit and how to make it so, because ultimately I want it so that there's a, you know, there are players who will have only 3 slots, and then there are players who will have 12 slots and players who have 20 slots. And so you can create these immensely long spell chains that are extremely complex, that are super powerful. But at the same time, a long, powerful spell like that will require a lot of energy and potentially could kill you if you don't have the energy or don't have a source of energy strong enough to supply that spell. So you have to be careful. I mean, just because you can cast those powerful spells doesn't mean you should. And so players might be better off getting really good at casting simple spells and using them in creative ways, and then slowly growing into bigger, more complex spells. So it's sort of a give and take. Not only that, but shorter spells are quicker to cast. For one thing, require less energy, are quicker to cast, and so you can, in combat, you can cast more of them in a short time and be more aggressive. Whereas a long spell requires concentration and time. You have to sit there and punch in the combination of elements, and you know, you'll still be able to move, but well, so this is where so going back, I did in each player will have their own choice. I want the controller to be completely customizable, such that there's no one single layout. There is one standard layout, but that every player gets the opportunity to change the layout to their playstyle. So one thing in particular for the standard layout is that the muddle sticks will be swapped for the movement. So left muddle stick will be for movement, right muddle stick will be for looking around. And now the arms and the legs are controlled with the thumbsticks. And the reason that that's so important is because the D-pads are for summoning elements. Jumping and crouching will be these buttons under here. The typical face button actions will be down here. Originally, these were going to be for summoning magic, but then I realized I didn't have enough buttons, and there were 20 up here, and there are 20 elements that I've come up with. Now, some of them I still need to work on and really figure out which elements are important. But you have, if I can bring up my elements list. There's liquid, gas, solid. So like water, air, and earth. Then there's life and arcane and shield, which are sort of, I'm borrowing from Magicka, and I'm borrowing a lot of this from Magicka, but I'm augmenting it. And then we have frost and fire, or cold and heat. And then we have the positive force, the negative force, time, and then we have the 3 elements of dimension, which is height, width, and length. And then we have sonic, or the vibratory force. And then we have light, gravity, spirit, scion, and space. And so it's those last 6 that I really have got to figure out. Gravity, I think, is one that will stick around. Space is one that I'm not sure of, because that might be the same as dimension. But at the same time, maybe not. Maybe space is different, because dimension is more a unit of measurement, as is time. Time is a measurement of the passing of events. So those are more measurements. And so I'm still trying to figure out how I can utilize those. Those are more augmenting spell elements, like time and width and length and height will augment how long a spell is cast for, or how wide a spell is, or how tall a spell is. But when you cast them, like, what happens if you summon just a height element? What happens then? Or just a width element, or just a length element? What happens then? Or a combination of just height and width and length? And what do they equate to? Or if you just cast a time spell, or you just cast a gravity spell, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, just casting a fire spell, that's pretty simple. You just summon fire. Just casting a water spell, that's pretty simple. You just summon water. It's, but these more complex ideas need more development. One thing, so for example, the positive and negative force are 2 elements that I still, again, need to figure out how they apply by themselves. Like, if you just summon the negative force, what happens? If you just summon the positive force, what happens? If you just summon a positive and negative force, or a negative positive force, what happens? And the reason why I say that is because if you summon a fire spell and then a negative positive, what you end up casting is 5 times the fire spell. So instead of casting the fire spell 5 times, fire, 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 you cast fire, negative, positive, and you end up with 5 fire spells. So you end up with 1 less element that you have to cast. And that might not seem like a lot, but when you're casting a string of, say, 20 elements, and you want 5 fire, and you want 4 earth, and then you want 3 say water. I'm just making this up as I go. To be able to save 1 element can be really great, because you can then get a more complex number of elements, especially, and this is the other thing. So if you have, say, a fire and a water, and then a negative positive, that means both the fire and the water are multiplied by 5. So it's that string of negative and positive applies to everything that comes before it, not including the previous elements. So what I mean by that is, if you go, say, fire, earth, negative positive, which would be 4 minus 1, which would be 3. Negative, so fire, earth, negative positive, and then say ice and time. I don't know. negative, negative, positive, or negative, positive, positive, let's say, which would just be 7, which would be 7 times, then you have 5 fire and earth, and you have 7 time and ice. Yeah, each. And you've only cast, so that's a total of 10 plus 14. That's 24 elements, and you've only cast 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 9. So 24 elements with only 9 button presses. That's quite a saver of time. Now that's a pretty simple spell with regards to the complexity that you can get, but you can get even more complexity when you also add in that the first string of negative and positive multiplies the rest of the spell. So say you keep that fire, earth, negative, positive, time, ice, negative, negative, positive, or negative, positive, positive, sorry. And before all of that, you have a positive, positive. You're going to multiply all of that by 4. So, I mean, to get into how the negative positive works together, basically the furthest right, the furthest positive to the right is the number, is the power of 2. So it's, if you have a positive, 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 it's 2 to the power of 3. So that would be 8. But if you have a negative in the first position, so negative, positive, positive, it's 8 minus 1. If you have a negative, negative, positive, it's 8 minus 3, because it goes 1, 2, and then 4. So so it goes 1 multiplied by 2, 2 multiple, and then actually, how does that work? Point is, they subtract. So if you have negative, 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 positive, that's 16 minus 7, which would be 9. So that's how you get all of the numbers in between. So it's sort of like binary, but it's sort of a reverse binary. And that's how you augment your spells, by making them more massive, more intense, by multiplying the number of elements. And you get more out of it because you don't have to cast. Like, if you have to cast 24 elements, you need 24 slots. But if you have only 9 slots and you want to cast those 24 elements, then you can do it by using the negative positive forces. That said, those negative and positive forces apply to your affinities, because you're gaining an affinity for those negative and positive forces. So there's a drawback. There's a give and take there. So whereas if you cast 9 or 24 fire spells, that's going to really, really make it so that you're a fire mage. Like, if you focus 100% on just casting fire spells, you're going to be a 100% affinity fire mage. That's great and it's incredible, but you're going to be really restricted in the kinds of spells you can cast. You're going to be casting only fire. That's it, right? Whereas if you cast fire and negative and positive, you're going to gain the benefits of having affinities for the negative and positive forces, and you're going to have the affinity for fire, and you're going to be able to create more complex spells because of it, especially because every negative force that follows or precedes an element creates the inverse element. So, for example, for fire, a negative fire element. So, say you go negative fire, negative, negative, positive. You're going to cast the negative fire, which is frost fire. So it's cold, but it still carries the qualities of fire. It's just now cold. Or say frost, or negative frost would be a hot, freezing element. Like, it still freezes things, but it adds heat. And so you can have a fire and a frost fire. You can have a fire and a frostbite, or negative cold, it's really complicated, and I still have to figure out how the system will work. But say you have a negative water or negative liquid. It's not negative. Sorry, it's not negative liquid. It's negative water, and the opposite of water is oil. Water is non-flammable. Water sinks, and oil floats. They have this, or positive air, which pushes as a gas, and you have negative air, which is a vacuum. There's I still need to actually think of. I'm still developing. I'm still working on it. So I apologize for the jumble of a mess. I'm trying to explain this, and it's still not even fully developed. But I mean, that's why I'm talking about it, is because I'm trying to, through talking and expressing myself, visualize and see where I still need work. And I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, I'm trying to develop the biggest, most complex game that's ever been conceived. I mean, maybe not that's ever been conceived, but that I've certainly ever conceived, and try and make it all mesh and work together concisely, in such a way that it's complex, it's powerful, but it's balanced. And that's the other thing. So the idea with this is that everyone can cast magic, but not every character can cast magic equally. So one thing that's really important about my game is that you don't have, well, you have, but isn't a humanoid. Your character is a spirit. It's just an essence of power that comes from a different dimension, and it's been somehow brought into our dimension in such a way that it can interact with our dimension. It can what's the word? There's a word. Inhabit? No. I mean, that is a word. It can control. It can what's the word? The word, I'm sorry, I'm Googling word for inhabit. Occupy, dwell, reside, lodge. No, that's not the word. But it can control. It has influence. It can. So it's essentially, there are people that this, I call it a hinge, an H-I-N-G or J, a hinge, that sort of is a oh, the word's on the tip of my tongue. To manipulates. There's a word for controlling, for control. Command, maybe. Dominate. Sure. I mean, these are all such good words. I know there's a word. Sorry for all this silence. It's bothering me that I can't think of this word. So anyway, the hinge will gain control of, and manipulate these beings, we'll call them, in a variety of ways. And so you can either influence them, and one way you do that is by using an ability which shows you their timeline. It looks into their future, and you can see what they're going to do and where they're going to go. And so you can see who they're going to talk to and what they're going to do at certain places. And then you can interact with that timeline, and you can alter it, and you can make changes to it. And you can also you can merge, or no, what's the word I use? Oh, there's such a I need to talk about all this when I need to prepare. I need to stop doing this so unscripted, because I need to have the words ready on the tip of my written down, so I can just boom, that's the word, boom, that's the word. Because this isn't good. I mean, I'm trying to practice. The reason I am doing these unscripted is because I'm trying to practice being unscripted, so that even when I have a script, I'm not so terrible, so that I'm good at talking. When I've lost track of where I am or anything like that. But basically, the hinge will merge with what I call a commoner. So basically, the world is filled with commoners of various races, each with their own abilities and plus, kind of like in Skyrim, you know, each race has its pluses and its negatives. It's pros and its cons. You know, a strength modifier and then an intelligence demodifier. And for example, and I'm not sure what the races will be yet. I've got a list of possible races, but I don't want to stick to the basic orc, troll, Khajiit, lizard folk. You know, I want it to be. I mean, I'll probably have some of those, but I want it to be more complex. I mean, but really, there's only so many races that you can really come up without making them entirely alien. And humanoid is the most standard, straightforward. I mean, we think in humanoid terms, and certainly as humanoids, we tend to believe that the humanoid is the most perfect form of life. And so I'm also going to continue on that vein, because I also think that the humanoid is the most perfect form of life. But that might not necessarily be so. And so my game will also feature other creatures that you can merge with and create, but that don't have the same qualities that the humanoids do. And what I mean by that is, you know, like if you merge with a beast or a bear, for example, like a bear creature, you can't then go up to somebody and just start talking and have a conversation, because the bear doesn't know how to talk. That's the limit. That's the drawback. Just because you as a hinge can talk when you've merged with a human, and you can control that. It's sort of like you gain the abilities of what you've merged with. You as a hinge are a being that thinks and feels differently than the creatures that you're inhabiting. But you take on the qualities and the abilities of what you inhabit. So it's a very, it's going to be a very interesting game. But the point is, you can also merge with characters and turn them into heroes. So you can do that in a variety of ways. You can either find someone who's pregnant and merge with the fetus, and which will have bonuses towards the stats of that character, based on the fact that it was born with a connection to the hinge, versus a human or a commoner who is, say, middle-aged, and it merges with the hinge. So has had life experience. So there will be pluses and negatives to both sides of things, because clearly, you know, a commoner who's lived their full life or most of their life without a connection to the hinge will have experience and qualities that someone who is born with a connection to the hinge won't have. And so the game will be very complicated in that sense. But the game is going to be a massive multiplayer online sandbox first-person survival game and creative suite. So what I want to talk about now is not so much the details of the game. I might get back to that in a minute. What I want to talk about is the fact that the game is also a creative suite. So going back to the controller and everything I talked about with the controller, the reason why I want to be able to do more with it with regards to a keyboard and mouse is because in the game, you're going to be able to write documents. You're going to be able to work and play in the same environment. So the game itself isn't just a game. It's not just a game like Minecraft. It's also a word processor. It's also a, what do you call, a spreadsheet editor. It's also a paint program, a video editor, a, what's the word? 3D modeling program, kind of like 3ds Max or Maya. And the reason why that is because I want people to be able to interact with the game world such that they can add things to it. They can draw things and then show that in the game. And so certainly I want it to be able to where you can import files from outside the game into the game. That's one thing, but I also want you to be able to export files from the game out to your computer in a usable format, so that players can actually work. So when you spend time building your dream castle, your dream environment, because certainly that's going to be a big part of the game is crafting environments and worlds and cities. I want players to be able to work then in that same environment, because you spend all that time building it. I don't want it just to be for play. I want it to be so that when you go to work, if you're a writer or you're working from home, because certainly this is mostly just for people who work from home. When you do that, you can work from you're just sitting in your favorite chair with a VR headset on, holding a controller, so that doesn't change. But you can go from playing to now writing that document that you need for your job. Or school. You could do schoolwork for those, if you have to write an essay, you could write that essay in your favorite environment. So when you look to your right out the window, you see all the bears and animals that you've tamed. You see the city that you've helped construct. You see just life going on outside, or you have any view. You could build near a waterfall and look out over the waterfall. And so you could be anywhere you want to be when you're doing your work. Or you could put up a holo screen that is a visual of, say, a beach. So you could build just a cubicle room and just have holo screens that show you a beach, And so I want people to have the freedom to do anything they want in this environment. So you move from play to work, back to play, back to work seamlessly. And that's sort of the dream. And so it's a competitive online massive multiplayer game that's also a workspace. And certainly I have to figure out where to draw the lines, so that for example, you build something. So I think there'll be two modes. There'll be a single player mode, and there'll be a what do you call a online mode, kind of like how there is for Ark, where your single player game can be untouched, will never be affected by other players, and you never have to deal with other players destroying your things or killing you while you work. But certainly if you are minded this way, you could set yourself up in the game world, in the online mode, where there's a risk, and you could work from there too. Just depends on what you are looking for in your Because I mean, that certainly would be thrilling, right? Is to be set up to such a degree where your base is protected so that you don't have to focus on defending it. You can just sit and watch Netflix from the comfort of your home in your castle that you've built, surrounded by your minions. And so a big part of this game is that there's going to be advanced artificial intelligence, which runs the kind of like in Sword Art Online, runs the questing system and how all of that works, but that also works the commoners, so that the commoners each have an individual personality based off of their life experiences, and is each individual commoner is so individual that you could carry on a conversation with them individually for as long as they care to, because each one has their own personality. You can't just talk to them indefinitely. They've got things to do and places to go and people to see. But if the conversation is engaging enough, maybe they do want to sit and talk to you for an hour or 2 hours. Maybe they want to marry you because they find you so interesting, intriguing, and you can converse with them. But the conversation will be fairly deep and engaging. They'll talk about things in their life that they're doing, things that they're thinking about, like, oh, I was thinking about how the mountains are like the sky's teeth. You know, they might say something like that. And if you come up with a response that's equally poetic, maybe they find you more interesting. And so it's going to be extremely complex, and the artificial intelligence that powers it is going to be extremely powerful and complex. And so that's why the focus of my education right now is in artificial intelligence. I mean, I haven't even started, but that's going to be the focus of my PhD when I eventually get to that point, because I want to develop, I mean, I've talked about this before, I think in the Test 1, 2, 3 episode, I talked about how artificial intelligence is sort of going to be a mark for me on my ability to express my own intelligence. If I can develop an intelligence that's as smart as me, then I've sort of reached godhood. That's sort of, if I can make it more intelligent than me, then I've surpassed godhood. And I've got to work on figuring out the nuances of that. But essentially, that's the focus, because the artificial intelligence is going to be the most. The game really won't work. Otherwise, it'll be just another Skyrim where all the conversations are scripted, and it'll just be boring. And I don't want that. I want every conversation to be so almost to the point where when you're playing, you're curious when you cross someone's path, when they say something to you and you're like, I want to find out more. I want to know what this person is thinking at this time. And you almost want to talk to all the commoners and have relationships with lots of them. And I'm sure if you might be already on top of me, in the sense that you recognize that a lot of this comes from a very lonely place, from a person who finds it not difficult to talk to people, but definitely difficult to talk about the kinds of things I want to talk about. And so I certainly want to create a place for people to practice. I mean, that would be amazing, is if people would come into my game and practice conversing and talking about things with this artificial intelligence, because so deep, because it responds in such a real human way that people feel safe in expressing themselves to it, and in how it responds to them, so that when they go back to their real life, they feel more confident in talking about things that are important to them. You know, it could be am I trying to say? It could be, well, my brain went on a tangent there where I started thinking about, well, not every commoner will have, because if every commoner has an open mind and is completely open to everything that you say, well, then that would get really normal and boring. But if you had to talk to them until you found one that was open to your kind of discussion, then that would be really interesting. If some of them were closed-minded, like if you started talking about homosexuality and this one, this commoner was closed-minded. I mean, certainly we have those kinds of people in our everyday life. Wouldn't it be interesting if in a video game you found an NPC who was closed-minded towards sexuality, but you could also find an NPC that was open-minded towards homosexuality? I mean, that would be incredible. If you found, a commoner who was racist versus a commoner who was, again, open-minded to all people of all types. It would make the world a lot more real and a lot more complex and engaging, I think, if you could be a part of that kind of thing. Especially and this is going to sound terrible, but if you as a person are open-minded, okay, so let's start there. You're open-minded as a person towards, say, racism, but you wanted to experience what it's like to be a part of a close-minded group of individuals, then wouldn't it be interesting if in this game you could find a group of commoners who had a secret society of close-minded individuals who, it's getting to a very dark place. What I'm saying is it would be interesting. It would be cool for role-playing purposes. I don't think it's ever been done before, and I don't think there's any reason why it couldn't be done. It would just be a very adult game. Let's be honest, it would be a very adult game, and the rating of the game might be X. Might not just be 18 plus. It might be X, or who knows? But it would be a very cool game, I think. For adults, it'd be an adult game. Certainly, I'm not saying kids might not play it. I would let my kids play it. I'd want my kids to play it. I'd want them to be exposed to real life adult situations, and let them play out the different ways that they might interact with other people who are behaving in certain ways. And so, anyways, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with all of that. I've probably talked enough about everything. It's been an hour and 13 minutes, and I kind of have other things that I want to do today. But this has been a good, I've thought of a few things that I hadn't really thought of before. And I really can't wait to really start understanding artificial intelligence and what its capabilities are, what its limitations are considered to be, that I might be able to surpass with my own personal insights, because I've always been very good at that. I've always been very good at finding things a certain way and improving them. Like, people teach me a way of doing something and I learn it, and then I get better at it and I improve it. I find a better way of doing it. Certainly, maybe not. I find it to be the most efficient, but certainly it might be the most efficient way for me. Like, that might be a caveat to the efficiency, meaning it's efficient for me. But there have been times when I do things my way more efficiently for me, and then I teach someone else to do it my way, and they are in agreement. Like, yes, this is the way that makes the most sense. It's the most efficient. There's no doubt about it. That's just been a standard across the board for me in my life. And so I certainly go into the idea of learning artificial intelligence with that mindset. Like, there's improvements that can be made. I can bring something to the table. I can see where there are limitations that can be, again, surpassed, I think. But we'll see. I could be wrong. I mean, it's not to say, I think there are thousands of people working in artificial intelligence right now, and how do I think? Why should I think that I'm any better than any of them? But it's just my mind. If I add my mind to the pool, certainly my fresh perspective, my life experience can affect the industry as a whole, I think. But we'll see. I've got years ahead of me. I've got to take 4 years of computer science to get my bachelor's degree before I can move on to my master's, before I can move on to a PhD. I mean, I think there are some people who do a PhD directly, like they don't move from a master's, or they do a master's PhD combined. Maybe that's a possibility for me. But certainly I'm going to get my PhD. That's my goal. I want that. I want to prove that I'm capable of coming up with some idea that nobody else has thought before, and showing the world what they can do with it. That's sort of the idea. I mean, if you've watched my learning Raptor video, then you already know I have come up with an idea of a completely phonetic alphabet that I haven't seen anywhere before. The only thing that comes close is the International Phonetic Alphabet, but it's far too complicated in my mind, at least for me. It's not unique. It's not unified enough that you could write with it in such a way that it's pretty and readable. It's a very ugly like alphabet, and I don't like it at all. It wasn't very well thought out. It's people just mashing ideas together, whereas I really put a lot of thought into making an alphabet that was visually appealing and unified in its structure, so that it would be easy to learn. And so if you go back and watch that video, you'll know what I'm talking about. Anyways, I think that's a good place to stop. We're at 1 minute 17, or 1 hour 17 minutes. So at 1717. No, I'm just kidding. I won't stop there. We'll call her quits. But thank you for being here, even though there's no viewers as I live stream. Maybe you come at some point in the future, and you just like the sound of my voice. You like the things that I'm talking about. You like the ideas that I'm presenting. This is mostly just for me, so I can sit here and talk and not have this be a complete waste of time. At least it's being recorded, and I'm able to come back and hear these thoughts. That's what's important, so that just talking to space, they don't get lost, right? Because if I was just thinking or talking to nobody, as I am, I mean, at least I'm talking to a computer, and the potential of it. I mean, I'm justifying what I'm doing right now, wasting time doing it. Point is, thank you for being here. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.